Hi, this is Felicia Gaddis. I decided to do my meditation on the Roman Centurion that's spoken of in Matthew chapter 8. One of the reasons I chose to do it is because he's always intrigued me. I understand that he was a man of great faith, but the problem for me was the fact that he didn't want Jesus in his house. So you'll see why in a minute. If you've been in the Christian church for any time, you've probably heard the story of the centurion. This is not a parable. It's an account of a Roman centurion, one of the fiercest warriors in all of history, who comes to Jesus to ask for the healing of his beloved servant. At first glance, the story from Matthew chapter 8 seems simple enough. The centurion needs help from Christ, and of course Jesus obliges. But there's a lot more to the story. There really isn't anything typical about it. The first and most unusual thing about the story is the fact that the centurion came at all. There is no indication that the centurion or his servant were Jewish, and at this point Jesus had only healed Jews. The centurion was not. Even the fact that the centurion was asking for help for his servant is unusual. Romans, especially Roman soldiers, were not known for their compassion. This man traveled a distance to ask Jesus for help. He must have cared deeply for his servant, who was not a citizen and by Roman standards, not terribly important. However, what I find most unusual about the story isn't the fact that he came to Jesus, that he cared about his servant enough to humble himself, travel a distance, and ask a Jew for help. This was extraordinary, but it's not the most important part of the story for me. Most people, when reading this story, focus on the fact that the centurion had great faith. Faith enough to believe that his servant would be healed at Jesus' request, because the centurion knew and understood the power of authority and chain of command. He tells Jesus himself, "For I am a man of authority, having soldiers under me. I say to this man, go, and he goes, to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it." And Jesus commended him for his faith, saying to his followers that he had not seen such great faith among them. So Jesus tells the centurion, "Go thy way, and as thou hast believed, so be it unto thee." And his servant was healed in that self-same hour. Story over, right? I say no. What struck me as the most amazing part of the story, and not necessarily in a good way, was the fact that the centurion didn't want Jesus in his house. This seems like the epitome of humility. He believes that Jesus is at the very least a holy man, and he may even have had the revelation that Jesus was God, and saw that he, a Roman centurion, a man of war with blood on his hands, was unclean. The Roman centurion was a well-trained killing machine, and there was nothing holy about that. He knew he wasn't worthy to have Jesus in his house, and that Jesus, as a Jew, would most likely not sit at his table, eat his food, or have anything to do with him because of his status as a Roman soldier. No good Jew would. So I believe the intention of the centurion was not to offend Christ with his request. How many of us have had that feeling? I know I have. I grew up Roman Catholic and with a very real understanding of what is holy and untouchable. I understand the centurion's intentions, but there are two very important things that many of us fail to realize about God. Number one, none of us is worthy. We have sinned and come short of the glory of God. That's according to Romans chapter 3, verse 23. And number two, it is God's greatest desire to be with us, in our homes, in our lives, in our families, and in our hearts. God wants to dwell with us. You can take a look all the way back to Genesis. After God created the heavens and the earth and all of the creeping things, after he creates the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve, he decides to come down from heaven and walk and talk with Adam and Eve in the cool of the evening. That was and has always been God's plan for us. It was only after Adam and Eve sinned, by eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that we were separated from God. In Exodus, God descends on Mount Sinai in fire and smoke to address the Israelites directly. But the people are afraid. In chapter 20, Moses instructs the Israelites not to be afraid, that this is only a test, but they believe that they will surely die if God speaks to them directly. Again, they reject God's presence. It is their fear of sharing space with God, with His awesomeness, that causes the Israelites to commit the sin of idolatry and worship a golden calf, something fashioned with their own hand, man-made, that they can control, something manageable. What we manage ourselves does not require God. To do this life well, we need God. We need His presence. We can't do it without Him. I believe all of us at one time or another have felt that we were not worthy to be in God's presence. But if you look at the people God deals with in the Bible, all the people He worked through and with to do marvelous things, they've all had to push past their unworthiness to receive the blessing of His presence in order to abide with Him. It is not our worthiness or our righteousness, but God's grace, His unmerited, undeserved, unearned favor that allows us to abide in His presence. The centurion was not worthy, and although he received the blessing of having his servant healed, and that did require faith on his part, which is pleasing to God, I wonder what he missed by not pushing past his feelings of unworthiness and inadequacy, his imposter syndrome, to invite Christ into his home to abide with him, even if only for a short time. So this Lenten season, as we prepare for Holy Week, let us reflect on all that Jesus suffered so that we could abide with Him and in Him. That although we are not worthy, Christ loved us enough to leave the fullness of His divinity, to take on human form, to suffer persecution and death, so that in Him we could become worthy, to enjoy the presence of God, and to realize Jesus' prayer for the unity of the church. I in Him, Thou in me, that they may be made perfect in one, and that the world may know that Thou hast sent me and hast loved them as Thou hast loved me. John 17:23.